Before we begin today's conversation, I want to remind you of something. People are complicated, families are complicated, relationships are complicated. Sometimes we hurt each other intentionally, and sometimes we hurt each other without realizing it. And sometimes we carry wounds that affect the people we love the most. And sometimes we expect people to become who they simply don't yet have the capacity to be. The goal of today's conversation isn't to convince you to tolerate abuse. It isn't to shame you or anyone for creating healthy boundaries. It isn't to minimize anyone's pain. The goal is something much simpler. The goal is to ask whether we've become too quick to end relationships before we've exhausted every opportunity to heal them. Because while boundaries often protect relationships, bitterness almost never does. So let's get ready to discuss the hard truth. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Go get you some water, stretch, and make sure you come right back so that we can continue this conversation. Before we begin today's conversation, I want to remind you of something. You are not your worst mistake. Life will test you. People will disappoint you. None of those things have the authority to define who you are. Victimhood survives in darkness. Freedom grows in truth. Let's get ready to discuss the hard truth. Welcome back to Hard Truth Talk. I'm your host, Jaynee Sasso, and today we're stepping into one of the most emotional conversations happening in our culture today: going no contact. Family estrangement, cutting people off. If you spend any time on social media, you've probably heard the phrases like, I'm protecting my peace. You don't owe anyone access to you. Cut off toxic people. And some of those statements contain some wisdom. Healthy boundaries matter. Protecting yourself from abuse matters. Learning to say no matters. But I also wonder if we've begun treating permanent separation as the first answer instead of the last. What concerns me isn't that people establish boundaries, because I believe boundaries are biblical, but what concerns me is how quickly we sometimes conclude that a relationship is beyond redemption before we've done the difficult work that healing often requires. The hard truth is this: boundaries protect relationships. Estrangement should be the last resort, not the first response. So, why is this conversation so difficult? Well, this conversation is difficult because family wounds cut differently. The people who know us best and also have the greatest ability to hurt us: parents, children, brothers, sisters, all of those individuals have the ability to hurt us, grandparents and spouses included. And so when those relationships become painful, the disappointment runs deep because the expectations were deep. We expected safety, we expected acceptance, we expected love, understanding. We expected those things. And when those expectations aren't met, our pain often tells us one story: distance, create distance. God, however, often invites us into another story, a story that has its foundation on wisdom, truth, forgiveness, and healthy boundaries. Sometimes reconciliation, sometimes limited relationships, sometimes continued distance, but always with a heart that remains open to God's leading rather than being ruled by our own bitterness. So, before we go any further, I want to make sure I make something very clear. This episode is not telling you to remain in a dangerous situation. If someone is physically abusing you, if someone is threatening your life, if someone continually violates healthy boundaries in ways that place you or your children in immediate danger, creating distance may be necessary. And sometimes separation is wisdom. Sometimes saying no is obedience. Sometimes leaving is the healthiest decision available. The Bible never calls us to ignore evil, it calls us to walk in wisdom. So today's conversation is about relationships and how difficult they can be, not necessarily dangerous, because those are two different things. And I think confusing those categories has caused many people unnecessary pain. So, one observation I've made over the years is that we sometimes confuse discomfort with danger. They are not the same thing. Having a difficult conversation is uncomfortable. Being corrected, it's uncomfortable. Being misunderstood is uncomfortable. So, setting boundaries can be also uncomfortable. Learning to forgive can be uncomfortable. Growth overall is uncomfortable. So, none of those things are automatically unsafe, though, right? Sometimes God uses discomfort to mature us. Sometimes the very conversation we're trying to avoid is the one that begins the healing. Now, discomfort should never be confused with abuse. Those are very different conversations. But if every uncomfortable relationship becomes a relationship we abandon, then we may never develop the emotional maturity that healthy relationships require. I want to leave you with a question before we move into the next segment. Have I been protecting my peace or avoiding necessary conversations? Because those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes peace comes after the conversation, not before it. And so, in the next segment, I want to share a little bit of my own story, a story about abuse, a story about repentance, forgiveness, and boundaries, and why I chose reconciliation with my father instead of lifelong estrangement. Because I believe that story illustrates something much bigger than my family. It illustrates the heart of the gospel itself. All right, we're going to take a quick break, go get you some water, stretch, and make sure you come right back so that we can continue this conversation. Before we begin today's conversation, I want to remind you of something. You are not your worst mistake. Life will test you. People will disappoint you. None of those things have the authority to define who you are. Victimhood survives in darkness. Freedom grows in truth. Let's get ready to discuss the hard truth. Welcome back. Welcome back to Hard Truth Talk. I'm your host, Jaynee Sasso, and we are moving forward with our discussion about going no contact and family estrangement. So, I want to move us from theory to something more personal because it's easy to talk about forgiveness when you're discussing someone else's life, right? But it's much harder when the pain is your own. And so many of you know parts of my story because I share tidbits in different episodes. I've walked through much tragedy, much trauma, all the things that life brings us, whether we expect it or not. I want to share a little bit more in depth because it's important. It's very important to know that this can be done in real life. So many of you may know parts of my story. My father abused me from early childhood until my parents divorced at about 12, 13 years old, where our family dynamic, that whole traumatic, toxic environment climaxed to a point where one fateful night, my father tried to take our lives. He did not succeed, thank God. He didn't succeed in taking his own. He didn't succeed in taking ours, but he did attempt. So for years, I never imagined that we would have any kind of healthy relationship. I did not talk to my father until, again, probably in my early 20s. So if you had asked me years earlier from that, if I would think that reconciliation were possible, I would probably have said no. I mean, um, I hated my father. I didn't want anything to do with him. He had caused me so much pain. So I couldn't imagine how could you repair a relationship with someone that brought you so much brokenness and hurt you so deeply? But then something happened because God began working in both of our hearts. I left home at around that 12, 13 age, went off to a boarding school, and I kind of explained in previous episodes that was God's rescuing of me and removing me from that environment and placing me into a different environment so I could understand that the life I was living was not the life that I would have to continue to live, and that there were other ways that people were living in other family dynamics. Sometimes we can stay in an environment so long that we believe that that's all there is, or that that is normal or natural until we encounter new people and new environments. So I believe that the Lord had removed me from that situation. I share my testimony in a previous episode about the supernatural way that that occurred because it was not of my choosing or my doing. God used and worked through people to help facilitate that. It was during those years, and I'm sure during my father's years, after, after he lost his family, realizing what he had done and to what extreme, and being shunned from the family and going through his own uh, type of situation with all of the ramifications that come with losing your family, losing employment, that the Lord was able to work on both of our hearts in preparation for us to reconnect at a much later time. So God began working on both of our hearts, and eventually God caused us to cross paths and reconnect. And it was at this time that we reconnected. It was right at the time that I had met my husband. So I was getting ready to get married, and I believe that marriages are impacted by one's upbringing and relationships with their mother, relationships with their father. And I believe the Lord knew that in order for me to have a good relationship and marriage with my husband, to raise healthy children, I needed to get that wound my father wound healed. So at this time, when I reconnected with my dad, I had met my husband. We were planning to get married. And God just knew that I needed to heal that part of my life with my father so that I would not transfer that pain onto my marriage or into the rearing of my children. And I would at least be aware of the wounds that I still had and how it might influence my interactions with my husband. So we reconnected somehow. I don't even really honestly remember how that happened. I was not looking for him, he was not looking for me, but we don't have to worry about how things happen. I like to say that's really none of our business. That's God's business because He is sovereign. When He wants to do things and work behind the scenes, He is more than capable, and He's going to do what He feels needs to be done to align us with His plans and with His purposes. So we came together. It didn't happen all of a sudden that we just became so close. I was concerned about who he was. He didn't know who I was anymore because honestly, he missed out on a big part of my preteen and teen years, right? So we were both very different people and we had to get to know each other again. So he apologized, not because someone pressured him, not because I begged him. He came with a genuine repentant heart because at that time, he was in a pretty low place in his life. Life has a way of bringing about humility in us all, right? So I believe he was in a very humble place in life. He didn't have much going on at that time, and life had really beaten him down. And he really had time to reflect on what he had done and the toxic environment that he had created and the abusive environment and just the magnitude of the pain that he had caused his family and the people around him and even himself. I don't believe my father ever wanted to lose his family. However, he did not have the tools or the ability to know how to get help. And this is another thing. We have to also remember that therapy and all of this diagnosing that we do today, that was not really a part of our everyday culture back in the day. I think my mom was almost a pioneering woman because she actually embraced therapy. That's how I learned about going to therapy and even knowing how to have the language to even ask or decide if I needed therapy. But she was a very few. She was not a many. We didn't have the mental health awareness that we have today. So when you are talking about being estranged or separating, you also have to recognize that the people that you may be wanting something from or change from may not have the tools, may not have the capacity because they may have grown up in a time or an era where that just was not a part of everyday life. And it most definitely was not. So I wasn't even looking for my father to go to therapy. I mean, that just was not a part of our culture. So I didn't ask him, did he do his work? I didn't use any of these labels or things to try to diagnose him. I just know he caused me and my family extreme pain. I wanted the pain to stop. He left and we were estranged and I was at peace and working on healing and growing from that situation until God saw fit that it would be a good thing for us to reconnect. So he didn't apologize because he had all the language and the tools. So I don't want people to think that he was like just this super self-aware person. He was not. He had to learn to be, and that actually would have taken him even more of a lifetime. He didn't really have that much longer to live. We didn't know that at the time, but he didn't have time to learn to be self aware and all that kind of stuff. I do want to mention that just because he had a repentant heart doesn't mean that his apology erased what happened. Repentance doesn't erase the consequences, right? Healing still is going to take time. Trust still has to be rebuilt. Recovery still has to happen. So repentance opened the door. It made me feel comfortable to engage with him again and to learn of him again because I only knew him as the monster he was when we were growing up. So an apology doesn't instantly rebuild the house. It doesn't automatically make the person that you hurt welcome you with, open arms and just want you to give you all this access because that definitely was not the case. He did not have complete total access to me. I would stop by and occasionally check in on him and see how he was doing. Eventually, we may have a cup of coffee. Eventually, we may sit on the porch. It was just a process. Apology doesn't automatically and instantly repair a relationship. It is simply the open door. And I think that's where many people become discouraged because we are expecting that one conversation is going to undo years of pain, and life rarely works that way. Healing, folks, is a process. It's usually a process. Yes, I totally believe in instant healing, but when you are talking about abuse or toxic behavior or pain that one has endured for year after year after year after year, as I did, those wounds are going to run deep. And instant healing just may not be part of the prescription. Even though we go through difficult seasons in life, God can take those difficult seasons and he can use it for our good. And I believe that that is what he did. I'm talking to you today and having the ability to share so much wisdom that I have gained by going through these things, and God showing me a different way, a biblical way to handle these things, even when I wasn't even aware. Holy Spirit was leading me on a path of healing. I was aware that I needed to heal, but I didn't know how that would happen. I didn't know what that would look like. Again, growing up in a time where mental health awareness was just not a part of the everyday conversation that it is. And we didn't even have social media. So there was really no way for me to gain or gather that information and consume it as so many of you have the ability to do today. So, in a sense, my path towards healing and reconciling with my father, really, God had to step in. He really had to, because I didn't have other voices other than the word of God and Holy Spirit speaking to me. Because most people that met me, whether it was friends, teachers, they didn't have a clue what I had gone through. So they may have picked up on maybe the way I handled myself, or, different behaviors that I may have had. None of us growing up during that time had any awareness of things like that. We just took people at face value. They were who they were. And, if you saw something in someone that you felt needed to be healed or needed to change, you knew to take it to God if you were a believer, and pray that that person would come to the awareness of what inhabit and experience repentance and a changed heart. So forgiveness, honestly, was the first step, because once my father and I reconnected, I had to make a decision. And I think that this is also an important. You have to have the right intentions. And I'm concerned that a lot of people that are defaming and castrating people out of their lives because they hurt them are not approaching the conversation with these family members, parents, grandparents, whomever. You're not approaching these conversations with great integrity. See, when I reconnected with my dad, I always wanted a relationship with my dad. I mean, most all children do. I mean, even when child protective services removes a child from the home that's been abused, it's not strange that that child would not want to be taken away. Most of the time, because it's your parent, they're your first heroes. They're the ones that you want to be accepted by and loved. So it's almost a conflict within your spirit that, yeah, this person caused danger and hurt and pain, but they're my parent and they're the ones that I want to accept me, right? So forgiveness had to be a part of the equation of healing when it came time for me to reconnect. And I believe that by the time I crossed paths with my father again, God had already started doing that work in me to forgive, because I don't believe if I had not forgiven him that I would have even had an open heart to receive him again or to interact with him. So one of the most important moments in our relationship came when I said to him something simple. I told him, I forgive you. And this was probably maybe even a year or two after we had connected. I recognized that he needed to hear that, because he had come to me and kind of expressed um, the fact that he understood that fateful night, as I described earlier, what he had done. And he just said, I was just so angry. And I'm sorry. And he would bring it up in just in odd ways, because again, back then we didn't have this therapeutic talk to know how to share your feelings and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, we grew up in eras where, children were seen and not heard. So this whole idea that people had the tools to be able to share and express their feelings was really something that was just coming about when my father and I reconnected. And when he apologized, when I told him I forgive him, I said another thing, important thing. We don't have to keep rehashing the past, Dad, because there's nothing that we can do about it. I know. I mean, because he was, tears were welling up in his eyes. He was really sorry. And because he understood. But there was nothing. And so I recognized then that he had carried around a lot of guilt and pain himself at because of what he had allowed himself to become and what he had done to his family. So the statement there wasn't to minimize what he had done. It wasn't pretending that nothing happened. It wasn't saying that everything was okay, but it was recognizing something both of us already knew. Neither one of us could change yesterday. We can't go back. He can't reparent me, right? So we could only do one thing, and that's decide what we were going to do with today in the time that we had left, as long as he and I were both going to be on the planet. I realized something, you know, if we had that conversation, if our conversations had just simply stayed trapped in the past, neither one of us would ever experience a future. And so forgiveness wasn't, again, pretending that the wound didn't exist. It wasn't refusing to let the wound become the center. It was refusing to let the wound become the center of the conversation. So I didn't want our reconnection to be rehashing what he did, why he did it. That wasn't important to me at that time, because I was actually at a point and place in my life where I really didn't need his apology, because I didn't even know I was going to reconnect with him. So I wasn't looking or waiting or hoping that he would come to me and apologize. So by the time we got to reconnect and we started talking about things, that wasn't an issue. I had already moved on. I had already made a decision that, I was getting married. I was gonna not repeat cycles. I just wanted to do the work that I needed to do so that I did not repeat the cycle of abuse and pain that I had experienced as a child. So sometimes healing begins, folks, with when you just stop asking, how many times are you going to revisit what happened? And you got to begin instead to ask, what do I want from our relationship to become from this point forward? Okay, so the past was the past. I had to think about, what do I want our relationship to become from this point forward? If we're only going to live in the past, we'll never be able to embrace and live in the future. So you really do have to come to these conversations with a sincere heart, one that really wants healing. I think some of us don't really want healing. We get addicted to the drama because we like the attention, and we like how our pain can be used to control and manipulate and to punish other people. And you've got to be careful with that, because that is definitely not of God. That is actually what we call witchcraft. When you're trying to manipulate and control someone else through different tactics and things that are not healthy for either one of you, right? It's not healthy for you because you're holding on to the past and you're not allowing healing to begin, and you're trying to control and manage someone else. So keep that in mind. So let me be clear, of course, just because you forgive doesn't mean you remove every boundary. Obviously, I mentioned that. My father and I didn't start off just having tea and crumpets, every day. It was a process, but I did have to approach that relationship with a heart and a mindset of that I had forgiven. And in order to protect and preserve that relationship, healthy boundaries became even more important. I was no longer the frightened little girl that he once knew. I had grown. I had healed. I had found my voice. I could speak up for myself, right? When you're a child, you are subject to the decisions and the behaviors of the adults that are in charge of you. You have no control over that whatsoever. But once you are an adult, once you are an adult, you have no excuse. You can speak up. You can decide if you want to heal. You can decide if you want to grow. You can establish clear boundaries. You can communicate those boundaries. And my father respected that, because those things matter. And so healthy relationships require mutual respect. So boundaries are not punishment. And some people, my father probably could have seen it that way, but I don't believe that he did, because I didn't present it to him as a punishment. There's an old saying, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? So you can be assertive, you can be forceful, you can be firm, but you don't have to punish or make someone feel as if you are doing this out of spite or out of deviancy, right? You want to just communicate that these boundaries are important to preserve the relationship so that there's not a violation that happens or occurs that, further damages the relationship. So you want clarity. You want to give a person the ability to know how to move forward. So, you can use the phrase, this is how we move forward in a healthy way. This is how we're going to move forward from here, right? Instead of, you can't do this to me. And I don't ever remember going to my father during that time with this just this desire to just be disrespectful and to just degrade him. I didn't have that in me because that wasn't my intention. Remember, I didn't even know I was going to reconnect with him. I didn't need his apology. It didn't matter to me at that point. I was perfectly fine. I was happy. I was moving forward with him, with him, or in or out of my life. I had a very different mindset, I believe, than many people may find themselves, because the pain and the bitterness was no longer ruling me, right? That wasn't the motivation. That wasn't the drive by that time. I had been healed from that part. So sometimes you do have to examine whether this is the appropriate time to reconnect. I'll share a situation that happened with my sister, who we were estranged for some years and we didn't talk either. And it wasn't her decision, it was actually mine. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But you want to make sure that your boundaries don't exist because you hate the person or you're bitter towards them or you're resentful. That can't be the motivation. The motivation has to be that they exist because you value the relationship enough that you want to protect the relationship. I don't want to give you the opportunity to further damage the relationship because it is fragile. If my father had raised his voice at me, or if he had done something that took me back to that day, because I believe for a time I suffered from PTSD, because I would date some guys, and when I dated them, if they did something or said something that resembled what my father had done to me, oh my gosh, I lost it because it took me back. So the boundaries are very important. So even when dating came, I recognized I could not allow a man to do certain things because that just was a red flag to me. It just wasn't going to work. The goal is really to allow your boundaries to create a healthy environment so that that relationship can thrive. But the key is you have to have the right motive, right? You're only going to do that, and you're only going to create boundaries from a place of based on your motives, right? And not out of the bitterness, the hatred, the anger, because you're trying to punish the person, right? So I never felt like I wanted to punish my dad by the time we reconnected. So one thing people have asked me is, why did I allow my father to know my children? Well, my answer is pretty simple. My children are not tools. I don't use my children as pawns. I set clear boundaries with my dad about how I rear my children and how he is to interact, because the reality is we all have what I call default settings. Okay. My healing was simply that I had to learn how to override my default settings. And what do I mean by default settings? You are influenced. I don't care what you believe. You are influenced by what you see, what you hear, and what you experience. Okay. I understood that children that are abused can sometimes have a likelihood to grow up and become abusers themselves. I remember hearing that growing up. And so I was at a time, I was actually concerned that having children might put me in a position where I would possibly become an abuser myself. So I did have a hesitancy around having children and having a family because I didn't trust myself. I had not yet learned that you can override your default settings. So we all have these default settings. So my father was no different. I didn't ask him if he went to therapy. I didn't ask him if he was going to seek counseling because that wasn't even a part of that culture at that time. So that I didn't, we just didn't talk. That wasn't an option. That wasn't a tool that we understood was going to be available to him, right? So I had to set my boundaries. And I specifically remember I ended up, my father and I had reconciled so much so to the point that he actually came to live with me and I took care of him till he took his last breath. He was there when my children were, toddlers and infants and growing up. And so, babysitting was fine. But again, if I saw him behave in a way that I knew didn't fit my values and what I wanted, I immediately stepped in and said, "Nope, we don't do that. That's not how I do that in my house. That's not how I handle my children. This is how I handle my children." And he respected that. So I wasn't telling him he couldn't discipline my children. I just explained to him that there was a way. So I didn't use my children as pawns. I don't use my children as a tool to punish people. I think that is one of the most cruel things that you can do. All children, I mean, my grandparents, first of all, my grandparents were so important in my development and in my overall survival during that time, that I would never think that the best case scenario would be to keep my children from their grandparents. My grandmother was and my grandfather were, they were everything to me. So I would never even imagine withholding that possible experience. Everybody's, grandparents relationships may be different, but my relationship with my grandparents was very on my maternal side was very special to me. So I would never even imagine uh trying to figure out, how I can keep my children away from my father. That just never occurred to me. So that doesn't mean, of course, that every situation looks like mine. You may have to keep your children away from their grandparents because of abuse or danger. And so obviously that's, to be expected. I would never tell someone to keep your children in harm's way. But every family is different, every story is different, every risk is different. I'm just simply telling you my story and how that has unfolded. So once repentance occurred, once boundaries have been established, once healing has begun, I just didn't feel the need to continue to punish him for who he used to be. He wasn't the same person. He was older. He was more self-aware because he had lived long enough to feel the impact and the consequences of his decisions, because his decisions didn't just impact me, they impacted him as a person. um, People want to know, well, what happened to your family? And my father was a very prideful person, so I'm sure he had a lot of splaining to do around what happened to this life that he probably tried to paint a picture of in front of friends and other family members. I'm pretty sure we've all been there, right? That's why divorce can be so difficult because, when you first start out, the person that you marry, you're telling everybody how wonderful they are and how in love you are. And then when it's time for the divorce, now you've got to explain to the people what just happened. Oh, he cheated on you. Oh my gosh, or whatever the case may be. It can be very embarrassing. It's a very humbling time because you recognize just how fragile life is. And so I'm very sure that my father had a lot of explaining to do from the people that he had come in contact and had had in his circle over those years to explain what happened. So you're not going to be standing in front of the same person that raised you when you were a child. Very different. Maybe the person is even aware that how they raised you was not the best. I'm pretty sure. I mean, as a parent myself, I can look back and I can say, you know what, I could have did that better, or I wish I had that opportunity again. I mean, we all um, can think of things in areas of where we didn't do it exactly the way we thought it would be the best, right? But as a parent, there is no manual. You are learning on the job. And all you really have as a point of reference is your upbringing. And so that's why I talked about the default setting. So he wasn't the man that he had been years before. And so that allowed me to have freedom because forgiveness had already been released in my heart by that point. So sometimes people think forgiveness means trusting someone immediately. It doesn't. Some people think reconciliation means pretending that nothing happened. It doesn't. This is where I think we also confuse several different words. And understanding these differences, it can completely change how we approach broken relationships, right? So forgiveness, reconciliation, restoration, trust, closeness, these are not the same thing. So we're going to talk about each one. Forgiveness is something that I choose. It releases the other person's debt to me, right? So I didn't go to reconnect with my father because I needed him to apologize. I had already forgiven him. I had already released him. Forgiveness is refusing to keep collecting interest on yesterday's offenses. Okay. So again, you have to go into these broken relationships. If you genuinely want to repair them, you have to go in with forgiveness. Reconciliation requires two people. It requires repentance. It requires humility, honesty. That's that integrity, communication, a willingness to rebuild. One person cannot reconcile alone. So you have to go into this with a particular mindset that has a focus, right? Whatever you focus on is what's going to expand and grow. When I reconnected with my father, my focus was on, wow, I get a chance to reconnect with my father. Maybe we can heal this. Maybe he's not the monster that he was that I knew, right? Maybe we can have a conversation as two adults now, right? Because now he's not my authority figure in the sense of parent child. We're on a different plane here. Let's see. And so reconciliation, however, is not restoration. Sometimes reconciliation happens, but the relationship is not going to return to what it once was, right? My father couldn't reparent me. We couldn't go back in the past and he redo everything. No. And that's okay, right? Because um relationships, not every relationship is going to return to its previous form. So we did not reconcile and then have this wonderful parent child relationship. One, because I ended up becoming his caregiver. So I ended up having to oversee him. So the roles actually ended up changing, right? And so as it often does, when you become a caregiver, right? The dynamics of your relationship change. So sometimes healthy relationships are going to just look different after healing, right? I mean, me and my dad, we would laugh. So we were not, like, oh, I love you. Oh, it wasn't that type of mushy, like, I just love you so much. No, we just had a really good, what I would like to say, we developed a very good friendship, a very good friendship. And we laughed. We reminisced about the good times of the past because I also had to, and I think this is important to share. Two things can be true at the same time. And so as I grow older and I start to get into this nostalgia for the past, I stopped one day and I said, Lord, why do I have this nostalgia? How could I have this nostalgia from my childhood when it was so bad? And I had to recognize that two things can be true at the same time. So there were times that I had experiences with my dad that were pleasant. And I had to acknowledge that. See, that's the other thing. Sometimes we want to demonize people so much that we don't even give them credit for what they did do right or what they did do good, right? So you have to be careful of that. And so our relationship after healing looked different. We were just good friends. I became his caregiver, and we moved forward. And so different isn't failure. It doesn't have to look the same. Maybe, I mean, I wasn't with my father every single holiday meal, every Thanksgiving, Christmas. Sometimes I went, to my mom's and he didn't come or whatever. I mean, it just looked different. So different isn't failure. Just because it doesn't look exactly the same as it did doesn't mean that you failed. It's different is just a reality. And you have to learn how to accept that, right? We also have to remember that trust isn't just given. So I didn't just give over trust. I didn't just say, oh, my dad is just a wonderful person now. No, we had to work on rebuilding that. Just because someone apologizes once doesn't mean that they have a true changed heart. And it also doesn't mean that they even know how to be different, right? Remember, everybody has a default setting. And if you're doing the work of growing in self-awareness and understanding your wounds and wanting to break cycles, and then you're gathering the tools and the resources that are required to help you do that, then you can start to override your default settings. But you have to how do you know that? You don't know that about a person when you are talking with them. You don't know if they've done their work. And I'm not here to judge him either. I wasn't judging my father. I didn't, again, we lived in a different era. I didn't go to him and say, did you do your work? Did you go get your therapy? Because I'm not talking to you unless you did your work. And what did you learn in therapy? First of all, therapy is a very private thing unless you are going to therapy with the person to work on your relationship. Um, that's just to me a very intimate thing, and it's not something that you should use as a tool to examine someone or diagnose someone or to badger them about who they're becoming. Because when I went to therapy, nobody did that to me. I went to therapy, nobody even knew I went to therapy. I did not look for the validation of my feelings. I knew I had been abused. I knew I had been hurt. I didn't need anybody to justify that for me. What I needed was to figure out, how do I deal with this pain and how do I heal this wound so that my life is not permanently impacted in a negative way by my experiences. I just wanted freedom. That's all I wanted. I didn't care how it came. I didn't care if he apologized, didn't apologize, because I was wise enough. See, when you stay in the word of God, you develop a wisdom that surpasses all understanding, because the word of God, God gives you his mind on how to see situations and circumstances through his lens. And I had already recognized that my response and my behavior has nothing to do with the outside world and what they've done to me. Has nothing to do. God, when I go before the Lord on Judgment Day, he's not going to ask me now, you did this, but I understand you did that, because no, because he's giving me the tools and the power through his word to transform my mind, to realign my vision with heaven's vision regarding my life, right? So you don't know where a person is in their faith. You don't know where a person is in their emotional healing and development. So trust can't just be given. Trust has to be rebuilt. And trust grows through consistency. I had to see that my father was consistently operating in behavior and relating to me as this person that he is today and not as the person that he was before. So trust grows through consistency over time. One decision, one conversation, one interaction. Uh, you don't owe immediate trust. Trust has to be earned, right? And the person should understand that, especially if they've hurt you. I mean, if somebody's hurt you before, why would you trust them? I mean, even an animal, If an animal is abused, they don't even trust people that they don't know, that they've never had this experience. My mom has an animal that was abused, and that dog still remembers whatever that abuse was. So that dog suffers from very bad anxiety if you move a certain way, because the movement of your body, if it resembles, their abuser, the dog gets frightened. So it's something that we just can't accept. That it, you know um, I just can't accept that they don't trust me. No, but my father never badgered me about trusting him again, because he knew that it was even a blessing and even a miracle in a lot of ways that I would even ever speak to him again. He probably never even thought that he would have the opportunity to reconcile with me again. Okay. So closeness is a choice. Finally, closeness depends on mutual emotional healing. Again, both parties have to do work, right? So if you are putting all the responsibility and all the blame on the other person, you're already defeated, because both people have work to do. And some people, they don't automatically have the capacity for deep relationship. Doesn't mean that they're bad people. It simply means that they're limited. Okay, again, to accept that my father may have some limitations. He may not be able, I didn't know if he would be able to understand the depths of the pain that he caused me. I found out eventually that he did, as he shared his guilt and his grief behind what he had done. But I didn't know that going in. I didn't even know if he had the capacity, because back then you didn't express your feelings. That just was not part of the process of healing, right? That's why we have so many families that have deep wounds, um, amongst different family members, because those tools were just not given. And so a lot of the times we're asking of people things that they just cannot give us. I mean, it even translated into my marriage. I remember asking God, like, God, did you see what my husband just did? Or why doesn't he do this? Or why does he do that? And the Lord was like, he is who he is. Now you have a choice. You can either embrace that, or you can go and try to find the perfect person, but you're not going to find it. Right? So you have to accept sometimes people's capacity instead of giving up on them. So I never gave up on my dad. I never gave up on my husband. I don't give up on people because they are limited. So the things that I'm sharing and the lessons that I learned, I've been able to apply that to all relationships, because I was a cut off person. I will, and even now, I have to pray and ask God to make sure that I don't respond in a way that just doesn't extend grace and mercy to people, because I can easily cut people off. So I'm not here to tell you that, I don't think about that or have that thought, but Holy Spirit will arrest my heart and say, wait a minute now, wait a minute now. Are you judging this through your flesh, or are you judging this through my spirit? How are you judging this situation? Because that's going to make the decision. That's going to make the determination, right? So you have to accept and be aware of a person's capacity. They may be limited. And so that's part of accepting reality. And accepting reality often creates more peace than trying to force someone into becoming who they are not. So, like I said, I, you know, my father could, it's just certain things, his makeup, he wasn't going to interact with me in a certain ways that maybe I desired. I don't even think I did, because I wasn't expecting that. But what if I was? He wasn't going to, he wouldn't be able to do it. I mean, one thing I can think of very simply is, at that point in his life, he was in a horrible place financially. So if I was looking for him to express his love for me by taking me out to dinner and doing this and that, Oh, I would be very disappointed because he was very limited. In fact, I had to pay a lot of his bills and take care of him. So that, he was limited. I accepted that. So as we prepare for the next segment, I want you to think about this question. Have I been expecting one conversation to accomplish what may actually require years of growth? Because growth is usually slower than what we want. And grace gives people room to become who they're still learning to be. So we are going to be right back. And when I return, I want to talk about one of the biggest mistakes we make in difficult family relationships. That is unrealistic expectations. And then we're going to walk through what I believe is a biblical framework for pursuing healing before deciding that a relationship truly cannot continue. We'll be right back. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Go get you some water, stretch, and make sure you come right back so that we can continue this conversation. Before we begin today's conversation, I want to remind you of something. You are not your worst mistake. Life will test you. People will disappoint you. None of those things have the authority to define who you are. Victimhood survives in darkness. Freedom grows in truth. Let's get ready to discuss the hard truth. All right, welcome back. Welcome back. Hopefully, you've had a chance to stretch, think, because I know today's topic can be a little bit heavy and very emotional for a lot of people today. So, I want to start off talking about in this segment one of the biggest mistakes we make in difficult family relationships, and that is unrealistic expectations. And then I want to walk through what I believe is that biblical framework that I referenced earlier. So, before the break, we talked about something that many people overlook when it comes to reconnecting and healing relationships. One, we've got to start with forgiveness because it's going to be really hard for you to have difficult conversations about painful events if you don't have forgiveness. Your vision is going to be it's going to be clouded with bitterness. Then there comes reconciliation. And you got to be honest. Do you really want to reconcile with this person, or are you just interested in punishing the person and making them feel just as bad as you do? Then after this, if reconciliation is actually your goal, then you're going to want to try to build a bridge of trust. And we talked about how trust is earned over time. And then as we're building that trust, as I did with my dad, then restoration comes. And that's when we became friends. We hung out. He moved in with me. I took care of him till he took his last breath, right? So they're not all the same thing. They're different steps, right? And so I want to move into what I believe is the heart of today's conversation because, excuse me, whenever I hear people say, I've gone no contact, my first question really isn't why, right? Because we all have a reason to disconnect from people and create distance. I mean, I'm probably the queen of going no contact. I mean, I can cut people off and it really doesn't bother me because I'm kind of a loner. I enjoy my own company. I've always been this way. I'm very introspective. So having a lot of, interaction and socialization with people is just not a thing for me. So that's probably one of the reasons why I can do it, and not really, be concerned about it. But I have to, you know, make sure that I'm in God's will when I'm making these decisions and I'm not being led by my flesh. So, my first question, usually when somebody says that they've gone no contact, is what happened before you got to that point, right? Did anyone know that there was a problem? Did anyone clearly communicate it? Did anyone truly listen? Did anyone leave room for growth? Or did the relationship just slowly die under the weight of the assumptions and the silence and the disappointment and the unresolved hurt? Because what I'm witnessing today is we are holding things over people's heads that they're not even aware that they've, done. It's almost like the jury says you're guilty and you don't even have a trial. You just automatically say nope, guilty. So do I believe that every relationship can be saved? No. But I do believe that many relationships are lost because nobody has taught us how to repair them. So to me, that is really the core of the issue. Is it's easy to cut someone off when you don't have the tools to learn how to repair the relationship, right? Because we don't realize that listening is a skill, conflict resolution is a skill. We walk around as if the assumption is, oh, you're just supposed to know. You're just supposed to know how to do that. No, no, no. You have to actually learn. I remember my mother working in one of her corporate jobs back in the 80s, 90s, and I remember she took a whole class on active listening. I mean, the book was this thick. We found the book maybe a few years ago, and I said, oh my, you took a class. The book was this thick, just on listening, teaching you how to listen. So you cannot assume, nor should you expect, that someone has the ability to really listen, nor should you expect or assume that someone has conflict resolution skills. Those are all skills that we have to learn. We don't just naturally have them and develop them as human beings. So that's why we struggle with conflict. And so most of us never learned healthy conflict. Why? Because you have default settings. You've watched your parents, you've watched your grandparents, you've watched television. Now we have social media, right? I can speak to that. My husband comes from a family that never yelled and they never fought. I come from a family that's all we did. Yell and fight. That's how we handle conflict. And so a lot of us have learned one of those two extremes. You either fight it or you avoid it, right? So in my family, yes, some families yell. In my husband's family, they probably just shut down. I didn't have the privilege of getting to know my in-laws, as they have already proceeded in death prior to us getting married. So I'm sure, because my husband never heard his father or his mother raise their voice or fight with each other or argue with each other, that they probably just pretended everything was fine, right? You have other families where they just don't speak again. And so very few people were ever actually taught how to work through pain. Now, you have to be honest with yourself. Do I really have the skills to help with this, resolve this conflict with the person that I'm estranged from, or considering being estranged from? And if you're honest with yourself, you probably don't. You probably don't. You can look at your other relationships and how you handle those, right? So distance, estrangement, going no contact is going to feel easier than healing because you don't have the skills. And the other person may not have the skills. Okay. But the distance isn't always healthier. convenient isn't always wise. Growth usually is going to ask more of us than comfort ever will. So if you are lacking the skills, then you have some work to do, right? Because a lot of the times we want to put the blame and the pressure and the responsibility 150% on the other person. And we just say, I'm the victim. So, you know what? I don't have to do, there's nothing for me to do. No, there's a lot for you to do. And remember, folks, these skills and your way of handling conflict is going to translate also into your professional life. You may not see it. I did not see it. I did not recognize that I was still engaging with people from a place of my childhood, where as a child that has gone through trauma, a lot of us feel we had to rescue and we had to save everybody. I still had that wired in me, that part of my default setting, because I didn't even recognize that was a part of me, and that was causing me issues in my professional life. It was causing me issues in my personal life because I was making financial decisions and making family decisions because I felt I owed it and I had to save everybody, which was impacting my health, my mental well being. And then once I got that straight, then God lifted the veil and showed me that, you're operating that same way in your professional life, because I was experiencing some things in positions of leadership where I got confused about my role. And I was trying to save people who didn't want to be saved, right? So there were skills that I lacked and that I wasn't even aware of until decades later. So growth, folks, is an ongoing process. It's not a one and done. So healing is not a one and done, because you do have to be mindful that you don't go back into those default settings. And what will cause you that? Difficult situations. So you have to go into this with a desire to grow, and you recognize and accept that growth is not going to be convenient. And that distance, you may be choosing distance because it's the easier route, because then you don't have to do anything. I mean, because who can't not stop talking to somebody? I mean, that's pretty easy. So let's talk about some of the steps to that process. First, let's talk about clearly explaining the process. I hear online a lot of folks that their adult children have estranged from them, made the decision to be estranged from them, that they are not being told what the problem is. And so one of the biggest mistakes we make is assuming that people know why we're hurt. Sometimes they honestly don't. Now, in my father's case, he knew, because his was physical. His was life threatening. Like he didn't even recognize. I believe, based on my conversation with him years later about that fateful night, I believe he was having a outer body experience that he didn't even recognize himself, that he didn't even know that he would reach the point that he would even want to take his own family's life. I don't believe he recognized himself. And so in that event, yeah, he knew exactly. But then decades later, I had conversation with my mom, how she hurt me. She didn't know. And I knew she didn't know, which is probably why I never really brought it up, because, I don't live in the past, because I understand people's limitations, and I don't want to. I don't. I'm humble enough to know that I don't really have a right to beat down on people, because I don't have all the answers either. And it may become a time that my children make me aware that I didn't do something that they thought I should do. But maybe I didn't have the capacity at the time to do it. So you have to be careful when, as they say, when you're pointing the finger, you have three pointing back. You have to be careful of that. So I don't go around like, okay, well, this one hurt me, and I have a right to speak about how bad of a person they are. I don't operate in that spirit. So, and if you are operating in that spirit, you need to check that, because even God doesn't operate in that spirit. Once He forgives you, He says He throws it into the sea of forgetfulness to remember it no more. So you got to figure out what spirit you want to operate in. So the person may honestly not know. They may doesn't mean that they're innocent. Doesn't mean that that what they did didn't hurt you. They just don't know, and it means they don't see things the way you see them. So you need to tell them. But here's my advice. I've also heard that a lot of folks are being talked to like a therapist by the person that wants to be estranged from them. No, just speak plainly, like you would to your friend. Use plain language. Don't use words that they've never heard before. When I was reconciled with my father, I did not talk about your inner healing and your self-awareness. He had no idea what none of that stuff meant. That's all psycho language that we have today that we use to try to at least explain or make sense of how we're feeling, even though I think a lot of the times we're using language that we really don't understand. It just makes us sound and feel superior to the person that we're talking to, especially because we know they probably don't know what that means. So we feel like, we're sophisticated. But I wasn't interested. When you're interested in healing and reconciliation, you're not trying to impress anybody. Nobody really cares. And at the end of the day, my father didn't care about that. He probably would have sat there and looked at me like, okay, I don't have a clue what she's saying, but okay. So you don't want to use words that they've never heard. That you don't want to use words that make it look like you're trying to diagnose them. You don't want to use words that sound like labels. You want to explain it like a 5-year-old could understand it. And if you can't explain it simply, you probably don't have enough clarity or understanding yourself. Yeah. So, perfect example, instead of saying, you know what, you're emotionally unavailable. Okay. Well, what does that mean? I need something a little bit more concrete. You might want to say, when I tell you something important and you change the subject on me, it feels like what I'm saying doesn't matter. Right? The one that says I'm emotionally unavailable it makes a person, be defensive because they don't really understand what you're accusing them of. But the other way creates understanding. And so what we also have to remember is that in this process of healing, it's not about winning, it's about healing. And there really aren't, there's not going to be a winner. Both parties, all parties involved win when there's reconciliation and healing. So the goal really should not be to win, it should be to be understood. What do you want that person to know about your pain and what they can do going forward to help not create that experience for you? You want to listen before you defend. So after you shared your pain and you've explained it, then shh, hush, stop talking. As they say, you've got two ears and one mouth for a reason. You should be listening twice as much as you talk. And you want to listen, not listen to argue, not listen to, prepare your response and tell that person off. You want to listen to understand their perspective because you may discover something surprising. They experience the same event very differently. Yes, we all experience. My sister she lived in the same household, but do you know that when we share our stories and our experiences, we have two different perspectives? And in some ways, you're almost like, well, did they grow up in the same house? But she was younger than I was. I was the firstborn. She was the second born. I mean, you can live in the same home and have very two different experiences of your parents. Because I received the abuse as the older child. My sister She was abused in a different way. She experienced what I call the aftermath. So the neglect and the just the tension in the home. So you want to recognize that it's not that they're refusing to see it your way, they just experienced it differently. So, but if you're going to heal, then it requires understanding. And so in the book of James, it tells us that we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And if we did that, we could just imagine how different our families would look if we practice just that one verse. Just that one verse. And then if a person doesn't understand, give them an example. But try to avoid words like always, you always do this, you never do that, every time. Instead, give examples. Last Thanksgiving, when we were sitting at the dinner table and you said X, Y, and Z, that caused so and so. During our phone call last week, when you said X, Y, and Z, this is how it made me feel. When this happened, this is how it made me feel. Specific examples create clarity, and it holds you accountable to make sure that the experiences that you're sharing are real, are tangible, right? My understanding also online is that we have a lot of influencers and uh, therapists who are guiding people into what to believe about their parents or their interactions and experiences with their loved ones. My therapist didn't do that. My therapist knew nothing about me other than what I explained to them that happened. And it was so concrete that I didn't need somebody to explain my abuse. If you need someone to explain your abuse, then you might want to, you know, question whether or not you were abused. Because if you were abused, I most definitely believe that you're going to know that you were. There's not going to be a question whether it's physical or verbal. You're going to know the exact words because I can still remember certain things that were said to me. I can still remember it. I didn't need the therapist to guide me through a process to help me, uncover some memories. So, because general accusations of things, it creates confusion. And God is not the author of confusion. We don't want to hold people accountable to things that aren't clear because then that becomes deceptive, right? Right? And because people can't fix what they don't understand. And so what I also hear a lot online is that people are being, because the waters are being so muddy and murky, and there's no clarity around events that have occurred, um, it's holding people in limbo. It's like you're holding someone hostage. Like, you did so and so to me, but I can't quite tell you when, but you did it. Hmm, hmm, sounds like a little manipulation. Because if it was that painful and that hurtful, you would be able to immediately describe it and share it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, could I remember every single episode of abuse that my father put me through? No. But I also know that your brain has a way of shutting down and erasing some memories. But I do know that culminating evening where all hell broke loose in my household and I had to run for my life because my father went into a rage and was going to take us out of here. So if you are abused, you know, and so you don't have to create this ambiguous scenarios and and hold someone hostage to something that you can't explain to them and they can't do anything about because they don't understand it. The next thing you want to do is you want to have these conversations, you want to paint a picture of healing. What does healing look like? See, so often we explain what's broken, but we don't explain what healthy looks like, because you probably don't really have an intention of healing. You just want to rehash and constantly make that person feel bad about what they did to you. Because if you really want healing, you're going to do your best to try to move to that point after you've expressed where the pain and the trauma entered that relationship. Where did it break down at? And so explain what healthy looks like. And you can do this simply by saying, you know what, I love for us to talk without interrupting each other. Or I like for us to call, have a conversation and engage in a call once a month. Or I like for us to respect each other's boundaries. Give people something to move towards. You help people. Uh, people are inspired when they can reach small goals, and then they start to feel good about the process. You don't want to just tell people, don't do this and don't do that. A perfect example, when raising my kids, I didn't give them a whole lot of do's and don'ts. I gave them things like, you know what, I'm not going to set your bedtime. I want you to learn how to manage your time. And so part of managing your time is knowing that you need to go to bed at X, Y, and Z time. However, if you choose to not go to bed at X, Y, and Z time, guess what? Your responsibility is going to be. You still have to get up on time and go to school. The first time that I have to drag you out of the bed and run around and try to, get you up and running, then I'm going to take that privilege away, and I'm going to establish the boundary that you have to be in bed by X, Y, and Z time. And I never had a problem out of my children going to bed on time, the time that I wanted them to. Why? Because they recognize that boundary wasn't there to keep them from having fun. That boundary was there because it made the next morning, when they had to get up and prepare for the day, easier than scrubbing your eyes and you're trying to figure out, and like, oh, the school bus is coming, and you're just all miscombobulated, and you forget your homework, and you forgot your lunch, all the things, that all the confusion that happens when you're trying to operate on not enough sleep. And until this day, my children my adult children, they put themselves to bed. And my son just told me the other day that his coworkers laugh at him because he says he has to be in the bed no later than 10:30. And they're like, man, but you in the bed 10:30, that's so early, But he said, no. He said, 'cause I gotta come to work with a sharp mind. He's an engineer. He said, I gotta come to work with a sharp mind. We got a big project. I can't think clearly when I'm tired. So it's the same principle. You want to give someone something that they can work towards, because what by me handling my children that way, it gave them a level of confidence that they could manage themselves, and that they don't have to wait for someone else to tell them what to do, how to do. Right? They don't have to be controlled or manipulated by another person, because they don't have the capacity to think on their own. No, you're not in a relationship with another child. You're in a relationship. You're trying to heal a relationship with another adult human being. So you've got to give people the ability to be autonomous, not that you're going to manipulate them. So you don't just want to tell people, just don't do that, and don't. Okay, well, how do I not do that if I've been doing that for so long? And really, where's the context? Because maybe what they do works with other people, it just doesn't work with you, right? That could be the case too. So again, those default settings are hard to override without a different perspective, or the ability to see that behavior through a different lens, because everybody's interactions are going to be different. Okay. And then you have to give people time. We all want people to change. We expect people to change. Nobody's changing right away. I mean, sometimes, but for the most part, habits die. Those habits die hard. And so this is one of the hardest steps. Is the waiting. I believe that this is where we make the decision to cut someone off because we don't want to wait for them to grow. We often expect that one conversation, is going to undo 30 years of unhealthy patterns. Life doesn't work that way. People don't usually typically change overnight, especially older adults. I can attest to that. Learning new things does not come as easy for me as it did when I was younger, right? I still enjoy it, I still accomplish it, but it's just not you know, a part of my natural rhythm, as it was when I was old, when I was younger. When I was younger, I would just try all kinds of things. Now I have to kind of think twice, like, okay, what is this going to require? Do I have the energy? Do I have the brain capacity? Like, I have to go through a whole little list of whether or not this is worth it. So things like emotional awareness, people may have never learned that. And so their growth and their development and that ability to grow self-aware is going to probably a lot slower, much more messier, much more inconsistent. They may not get it right every single time. Sometimes it may even feel like the relationship takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But you know what? Grace leaves room for growth. You can tell when someone is honestly and genuinely trying to make an effort. And you have to be willing to give them space to grow. Not because the growth is going to be guaranteed. That's the other thing. You know, when I got married, and I give this advice to many people, don't marry someone based on potential. You better marry that person based on who they are right now. Because I asked myself that question when I got married. I said, okay, now this person is this way. Now you would prefer them to be this way, but if they never change, are you okay with that? I had to look myself in the mirror. Okay, you're okay with that. So we're not getting a divorce because that part doesn't never changes. But guess what? A lot of things did change. Why? Because people grow. But I've been married getting close to 30 years though, right? So I had to wait the process. But guess what? My husband had to wait the process on me too. It's not, see, this is the thing. When we think about reconciliation and healing, we often, again, put all the responsibility and the weight on the other person. But we don't realize, or we realize it, but we don't want to acknowledge that we're part of the solution as well. We have a role to play because transformation takes time. You are not the same person you were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, 20, whatever. None of us are. Hopefully, we are growing and evolving as we learn new things, as we become aware. We begin to transform. And so, God has been patient with all of us. And you want to extend that same patience whenever wisdom allows. Can I give someone room to grow the same way that God has given me room to grow? Or have I demanded instant maturity from someone while forgetting how patiently God has waited and worked in me? We need to really reflect and ask ourselves that question honestly. So before we continue, if Hard Truth Talk has challenged you, encouraged you, helped you grow, consider supporting the podcast by buying me a cup of coffee. Your support helps make these conversations possible and allows this ministry to continue to reach people with calm biblical truth in a loud culture. The link is going to be in the description, and thank you for being a part of this journey. And when we come back, we're going to talk about something I think is missing from many conversations about family healing. And that is how to address recurring patterns without weaponizing your pain, and why counseling isn't a sign that your family has failed. It may simply be the wisdom your family has needed all along. So we are going to be right back. All right, we're going to take a quick break, go get you some water, stretch, and make sure you come right back so that we can continue this conversation. Before we begin today's conversation, I want to remind you of something. You are not your worst mistake. Life will test you. People will disappoint you. None of those things have the authority to define who you are. Victimhood survives in darkness. Freedom grows in truth. Let's get ready to discuss the hard truth. Welcome back, and we are in the final segment of today's podcast, and we've talked about a lot. We've talked about boundaries, we've talked about forgiveness, we've talked about communication, we've talked about giving people room to grow. Now I want to talk about something that is the biggest obstacle to healing, and that is pride. Not because pride only exists in the other person, but because pride also exists in every one of us. And if we're honest, sometimes the greatest barrier to healing isn't the other person's unwillingness, it's our unwillingness. So we got to ask ourselves, you know, one of the healthiest things that I've learned is this. We know that healing isn't usually one conversation, it's many conversations. So once you've had that initial conversation, you have to learn how to ask permission. Ask permission to continue the conversation. And you would simply say, would you be okay if I gently pointed out this thing that you do or don't do when I notice it happening again? Why? Because now correction is going to become a partnership, right? You want to work together with that person to help them become more self aware, to recognize when they are behaving or acting in a way that is a pattern of behavior that is causing you pain. So you don't look like you're attacking them now. You look as if, and you're positioned empowered to actually help them. And I think that that's also very challenging for people. Why should I help why should I help that person? It all comes down to, what do you really want? What is your motivation? Because the reality is most unhealthy patterns have been repeated for years. And you can't expect years of habits to disappear after just one difficult conversation, because the issue is going to happen again. And you've got to brace yourself for that. You know, my father didn't always tell me exactly what I think he should have said all the time. But I recognize that it's a certain pattern. And so when the issue happens again, you want to be empowered by asking permission so that you can address it immediately. You don't want to let bitterness and disappointment and silence take root in your heart. You don't want to wait 6 months. You don't want to sit around or at least appear like you're collecting evidence and trying to build a case against someone so that you can explode after the 10th offense. To me, that is a lack of integrity when you do that. It translates to me, it translates similar to me. And like I told you, things that happen in your personal life are going to transfer into your professional life. So, how I had to look at it when, as a manager of people running a business, I always want to operate in integrity. So, when I hire someone, during that little probationary period, I mean, we don't really call it that, but that period of time where I'm trying to decide if this is a good fit for them, and they're trying to decide if this is a good fit for them, I don't wait till they're late 10 times to tell them, you know what, we don't tolerate lateness here. No, that would be, to me, that's not being a person of integrity, because you're setting that person up for failure. Because maybe, just maybe, because somebody might say, well, they should know to just be on time. No, 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 no. Because you don't know what environment they came out of. Maybe their past employer being on time wasn't an issue. Maybe they worked at a job where they were not, where their time did not have to be managed as strictly. See, I had to recognize, because of the healing that took place in my personal life, I can now handle my professional life in a much more different way and with greater grace, mercy, and wisdom. Because I recognize that person may have come from a job that did not require that of them. They maybe had a job where they managed their own time. And now they've transitioned into an environment that is operating completely different than what they're used to. So if I explode after the 10th offense and say you're fired, that person never had a chance. And that person may even have said back to me, but you didn't tell me, or why didn't you tell me? So I learned how I healed my relationship with my family members and things. I translated that over to my professional life, because I would be a horrible, horrible leader and manager if I didn't get that personal side straight, because I would transition that and transfer that over to my professional life. And I would be a manager that would just be collecting evidence so that I could just, oh, I'm a fire them. I don't like firing people. It's not a good feeling. And so for me, I like to give people a chance. I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to extend grace and mercy to you. Why? Because my ultimate goal and intention and motive of my heart is not to bring harm to people. See, that's the thing. Again, and I know you've probably heard me repeat this several times throughout the podcast today, because I don't believe that the way people are acting and responding within this conversation of going no contact, that people are really being genuine about where their hearts are. Because I see people using their pain as a weapon. And so if you're using your pain as a weapon and you're holding people hostage, and you're not telling them when you're offended or when you're hurt, and you're not talking about today's issues today, then you're not being fair. You're not giving a person time to process what you just brought to their attention. Because sometimes people need time to think. That person that, going back to that example about being on time, that person may have to really sit down and restructure their life and their day so that they can adhere to the requirements of this current job that they're in, which is to be on time, or to be not so much on time, but to be ready to begin the workday at a certain time that has been outlined by the organization, where they came from an environment where the organization didn't give them that type of criteria. You don't know what people have to go through to make those adjustments so that they can grow and develop into a different person and into a different way of being. You got to give people time to pray. Some people need the Lord. Again, they may need God to show them, like, Lord, I'm getting feedback. about my behavior and about people's experience with me. Help me to understand, help me to change, help me to show where I'm falling short. They have to have time to recognize something that they've never seen before. And so healing is not a courtroom, it's a journey. And I think most of what I'm hearing online is we're putting people on the stand of public opinion, and we want to judge them, and we want to make them suffer as a form of, of the verdict. And then we want to leave them there. We want to say there is no redemption, there is no reconciliation, there is no way for you to redeem yourself. And wow, is all I really can say, because there's many times that I needed the mercy and the grace that others extended to me because I was not the best person that I could be. So it's a journey. And so if you are having a difficult time seeing through the lens of forgiveness and not bitterness, and not and having a difficult time painting a vision of healing, as we discussed earlier, it may be wise to get outside help. If in fact you truly want to heal and repair the relationship, and you see that that is really possible, again, not dangerous, you're not in a dangerous situation or that kind of thing. You just don't know how to deal with conflict in a healthy way because maybe you don't have the tools. So if you can be humble and admit that you too are limited as the other person is limited, then seeking wise counsel and outside help may be the best thing that you could do. Because sometimes families reach a place where they simply, again, don't have the tools. That doesn't mean they don't love each other. It doesn't mean that your situation is hopeless. It means you need help. And I believe one of the wisest things that a family can do is invite someone outside the family system to help. It could be a qualified family counselor, Christian therapist, mature pastor, someone trained to identify healthy patterns, not someone that's going to automatically take a side, because that's not, I remember when I went through therapy, my therapist never said, wow, your father was a horrible person. I don't remember my therapist telling me that. I remember my therapist focusing on me, my healing, and what tools and resources were at my disposal so that I could get past, so I could rise above that situation and get past it. The conversation did not focus on how bad my father was. First of all, I didn't need to know that. I mean, it was pretty obvious. I went through the trauma, I went through the pain. I didn't need I wasn't in therapy to rehash the past about how bad he was. I wanted to get to a place where that past did not impact my future in a negative way. So you don't want a therapist that takes sides. You want someone who helps everyone see their blind spots that they cannot see themselves. Because every family has blind spots, even yours, mine. And so sometimes healing begins because someone finally helps everyone speak the same language, right? So if you are being asked to go to counseling, don't immediately reject it. Consider it. It may be the one thing that really helps to get you and your family aligned and towards the same goal. Because again, it is not automatic that we have communication skills, listening skills, or even conflict resolution skills. So don't look at counseling as a failure. It's wisdom. Give everyone grace. Um, it's really hard, but it's necessary. You got to not only give someone else, you got to give yourself, and then you can give others, because growth is going to take time. Healing is going to take time. Changing lifelong habits takes time. As I said, unhealthy patterns have been happening for years, decades. We all have those default settings. We're not going to get away from those default settings without intentionally doing so and then putting into practice the behaviors and the thinking patterns that are required to override those default patterns. And so God has been patient with all of us. He's been patient with me. He doesn't excuse sin, but he patiently walks with us while we're being transformed. And we can extend that same patience to us if we desire to. Of course, not without boundaries, not without wisdom, but with grace. And so I want to say something that may be just as difficult to hear. Sometimes we weaponize our healing. We weaponize therapy language, we weaponize boundaries, we weaponize silence, we weaponize access to grandchildren, we weaponize our pain, and sometimes we even weaponize the phrase, I'm protecting my peace. Healing should never become another way to control people. That's witchcraft. Healing should make us more like Christ. Not more self righteous, not more superior. So you ask yourself, am I really pursuing healing or am I using healing language to justify bitterness? Because those are two very different things. You may be saying you're protecting your peace, but you could be just protecting your pride. And so I want to ask one of the hardest questions of today's conversation. When I say I'm protecting my peace, what does that really mean? Is it the God that's in me that's speaking? Is my heart posture correct, or is my pride speaking? Because sometimes we're protecting our feelings, our hearts, and that can be appropriate, but sometimes we're protecting ourselves from continued harm. And yes, that's wisdom. But sometimes, if we're honest, we don't want another conversation because we don't want to be vulnerable again. We don't want to hear something about ourselves because we may need to change something. We don't want to admit that we also contributed to the conflict. That's where pride. Pride is quiet. It quietly convinces us that everyone else is the problem. Remember, I talked about one finger pointing at others, three pointing back. But humility is going to ask a very different question. Humility is going to ask, Lord, what are you trying to teach me? That's why it was so easy for me to reconnect with my father and to be ready for that opportunity, because I had already went to God and said, God, I need help. Because yes, that person did something to me, but who I've become as a result of it, it's not good. So just like David prayed, search me, O God, and know my heart. See if there is any offense in me, any offensive way in me. That's one of the most encouraging prayers in the scripture. It's the most courageous because it invites God to expose us before we spend all of our energy exposing everyone else. Because healing requires humility, not perfection, humility. So I also don't want anyone to leave this conversation thinking I'm saying that reconciliation is always possible, because it may not be. It isn't. Sometimes someone refuses to repent. They just refuse to change. They want to continue the abuse. The manipulation doesn't stop. And so sometimes your safety, your children's safety is genuinely at risk. And so obviously in those situations, distance, you just may not have any other choice. um, or maybe the boundaries have to become stronger. And in some situations, no contact at all may be the wisest and safest decision available. And then it doesn't mean that you failed. It means that you've recognized the reality. So what I'm challenging isn't wise protection here. What I'm challenging is our culture's tendency to recommend permanent estrangement before we've exhausted every opportunity for biblical reconciliation. So as I've reflected on this topic, I keep coming back to one truth. If God required perfection before relationship, none of us would belong to him. So while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. Think about that. Grace came before we even deserved it. That didn't mean that God ignored our sin. He didn't. The cross proves how seriously God takes sins, but it also proves how deeply he loves broken people. That truth should shape how we approach broken relationships, not with naivety, not without boundaries, but with humility, truth, mercy, and hope. The ministry that we've been given is the ministry of reconciliation. That doesn't guarantee every relationship will be restored, but it should shape the posture of our hearts. So before you decide to close the door forever on that relationship, ask yourself these questions. Have I clearly communicated? Have I listened? Have I established healthy boundaries? Have I forgiven? Have I left room for growth? Have I sought wise counsel? Have I prayed? Have I honestly asked God to search my heart? Have I done everything that God has asked me to do? Notice that the question isn't, have they done everything? Because one day we won't answer for someone else's obedience. We'll answer for our own. So, family is messy, people are imperfect, relationships require humility, boundaries require wisdom, forgiveness requires courage. Healing requires surrender. And so some stories will end with beautiful reconciliation, like me and my dad, but some won't. Some apologies will never come. Some conversations will never happen. Some relationships may never become what you hope for them to be. I mentioned earlier that I would talk about my relationship with my sister. You know, I had to stop. I had to um, separate and distance myself because I recognized that I was falling into default patterns that was making it hard for that relationship to move forward in a healthy way. And so I was judging. I was calling myself trying to save her and keep her and have her live a life that I thought she should live. And guess what? Maybe after not connecting for maybe 4 or 5 years, we connected, and now I was ready to move forward in that relationship in a very different way. She doesn't feel judged. I don't feel the need to or responsibility to save her and try to correct her. No, I've accepted her limitations. I've accepted that she has only a certain capacity, and I've given her room to grow. And guess what? She's doing the work now to grow. Not because I judged her, not because I badgered her, not because I punished her or told her or reprimanded her, because I gave her space to grow. So don't let another person's unwillingness determine the condition of your own heart, no matter what side, whether you're the person cutting off and being distant, or you're the person that's being cut off and pushed into the distance. Don't let your pain become your pride. Don't let pride prevent your healing. And don't become the very thing that wounded you. You know, that was when I went to therapy, that was my goal. I said, I don't like who I'm becoming. You want to become the person who breaks the cycle, the person who tells the truth with mercy, the person who establishes healthy boundaries without building up walls around your heart, the person who trusts God enough to let him heal what people could never repair. No matter what, my father could never say enough to repair the damage that had been done. So ultimately, there is only one perfect father. Not mine, not yours. There's only one. and that's the Lord Jesus Christ. And so the rest of us parents out here, we're just learning. Some parents never learn healthy love. Some children never learn healthy honor. That's another topic in and of itself. Honoring thy mother and father. What does that really mean, and what does that look like? Doesn't mean obviously tolerating abuse and neglect, but there is an honor for the fact that God used those individuals to bring you into the world. And so we have to recognize that some families just carry generations of pain. Are you going to be the one that breaks that cycle? But the reality is Jesus entered broken families and broken people and broken stories to reconcile us first to God so that we could begin to learn how to reconcile with one another. That is the hope of the gospel, and that is the hard truth. If today's conversation challenged you, I encourage you to spend time in prayer before making any major decisions about difficult relationships. Ask God for wisdom. Ask Him to search your heart. Ask Him to show you your next faithful step. So if this episode encouraged you, share it with someone navigating a difficult family relationship, and be sure to subscribe to Hard Truth Talk for more calm biblical truth in a loud culture. And until next time, remember, truth without mercy becomes harsh. Mercy without truth becomes confusion, and God is calling us to both. So be kind, keep it classy, and I will see you in those comments. Till next time.